Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'm going to do in my speech is characterize the current situation that the Global South Fellowship is currently experiencing, what the current trends of the Anglican society is experiencing, and why there's an incentive to move towards the Great North Anglican Society, and why this current trend and progressive is going to work. I'm gonna talk first, characterize like why it is of the interest, what the interest of the Global South is, and like why it's important that they need to conserve themselves and protect themselves and maintain their preserve themselves. The second is I'm going to talk about like the why the Great North is incentivized to accept them, and why it will be a great cause for them, and why it will be great to have this synergetic relationship between the two. And then thirdly, I'm going to make a push about like why just like if we don't do anything, if we don't decide to leave, how that's just going to be fundamentally worse for us on all sides in terms of like affecting our interests. So a bit of characterization first. So I think the first thing to recognize is that the current COA that the GSF is currently a part of is starting to become like incredibly contradictory and like conflicting in terms of like the ideas that they're trying to push. I think like the idea of like the priests and like this all these liberal ideas and reforms are really important issues that affect like the entire like understanding of our lives, and we think that these issues are likely going to perpetuate in the future and cause more rifts and conflicts if no decision is being made, because we think that there's a fundamental rift between the two. I think that is likely accepted by the negating side, and that like we have to deal with these kind of situations. I think secondly, the most important thing is that there is simply a fundamental incompatibility in terms of like the conservative norms that the GSF is currently pushing, and then the liberal reforms that is suggested otherwise. We think that it is important that like no person has to be forced to accept like two different conflicting forms that cannot simply coexist together, and that's simply just like not impractical in terms of like the way of life and the way of living. And we think that that is simply not possible. And thirdly, I think that as the interest and the role of the GSF itself, I think that they're like the ones who are spearheading the conservative front on the Global South, and we think that that is an important thing in terms of conserving and pushing this message in terms of like in their influence and the importance in the region in the Global South. So a couple of like characterization of the interests of the Global South. We think that firstly, they want to like preserve the institution itself. And we think that they need to do it in two main ways. The first is they need to be streamlined in terms of like the ideology that they're pushing. I think that it is important to realize that those two are really conflicting issues, and it's impossible for them to coexist together, which is why it is important to not alienate the people that they're saying, and we think that having a streamlined and more like focused approach towards like these issues is the most important. The second thing is that we need to preserve the members who are still part of the team, part of the movement. We think that it is most important to preserve the most devoted and conservative people who are part of the movement, because those are the people who likely have the most influence. Those are the people who have like participate in like preaching to other people, like spreading this idea, and we think that those are the most influential people in the movement. And we think that insofar as we alienate them and consider like these contradictory views, we think that either they're likely going to first leave the constitution entirely and just like move their membership to the Greater North, or secondly, the participation or the level of participation is just going to significantly dwindle. And we think that this is extremely like devastating for the Global South, especially when the most devoted members are the most influential people as part of their group. So I'm going to talk about like why this is going to be extremely harmful for the global South if they don't decide to leave, and why it is incredibly important to create a streamlined message. We think that the first is like as I've talked about, like this idea that like as like more of the COA becomes more progressive, I think that more of the conservative people are being more alienated, and like they're likely going to be like question like the goals and the ideals that are being preached by them. And so we think that there is already like movement of like these people, the more conservative people, going into like the greater north. We think that secondly, it is important to cater to the majority view of the current. We think that it is important to cater to the majority view of the current members. We think that it is important to have like streamlined discourse and make sure that there's no conflicting ideas. And we think that insofar as there's like conflicting ideas and stuff, we think that this discourse is going to be harmful on our side in this group, and it's going to be more harmful. It's going to cause more damage to the overall like integrity of the society itself. We think that also like spreading a mainstream and streamlined message is important because I talked about like how it is practically impossible for someone to have like a duality of like different beliefs. We think that no person is possible to have like two conflicting beliefs and like trying to manifest and like trying to meet in the middle. We think that this is simply impractical due to the fact of like the way of living, how people are brought up, their cultures and their lifestyles, their whole raising has been influenced by how their beliefs. We think that this simply does not exist. The second is like we talked about how there's going to be likely lead to factions between like the different groups in the society. We think that the more conservative group is likely going to either consider leaving to the greater north, or this faction is just going to be like overall like conflicting with like the moderate views. And we think that this is not ideal on their side of the house. We think that, okay, which leads on to my second point, which is like why it is important for us to maintain the funding and maintain the membership of the people. Because as I've talked about, the most influential members of the groups are the most devoted, are the most conservative people. We talk about like people like the Mormons, and who are like the guys who are like the most conservative. Even though like they are like a small niche group, they are still like going strong because of their conservative ideology, because it's gone through generations and generations that have been like passed down and so and so. And we think that is important, and like that kind of streamlined messaging is important. We think that insofar as like we conflict with them and like this causes conflict, we cause this kind of alienation, we cause this kind of confusion, which I think is devastating for our side of the house. We think the second thing is like, as I've talked about, the role of like the most influential members is their ability to preach to other people, to get more members into the cause. We think that when we lose this ability, we even lose the ability to attract like alienated people who are not part of the community from the global south, who we otherwise could have recruited. Because we think that given that like the majority of like the different groups is trending towards like the more conflicting ideology, we think that there's more people who are likely going to be alienated. And like if we don't take advantage of like these kind of groups, it is going to lessen our impact and lessen our membership. And we think that finally, just the idea of like us like being part of the COA, as we lose more memberships, we think that we lose more power and influence in terms of like decision making and like being able to like vote on certain topics in and of itself. And we think that overall, like as I already talked about, like there's people leaving. We think that the influence is already dwindling to the point where like I think like even if we don't leave, I think that our impact or our ability to make decisions and vote on decisions is simply not going to work. And we think that just having this ability to preserve like the donations, preserve like the funding is most important on our side of the house. So for all of those reasons, we want to preserve them. Proud to affirm.
Oh no, I'm just waiting if you're ready.
Oh yeah, I'm ready.
Cool. All right. I thank first Alf for that excellent speech. I now invite first Neg to begin the opposition case. Here. You guys do have a minute, so...
We just have a team handshake and I want to do it on camera.
Yeah, I mean, only you are in frame, Jack, so...
Enjoy it.
It's probably going to be tight.
Year 2 round 2 of a, like, of these. You are. Do that now. You? I need to get that.
I think the point at which affirmative loses this debate is that they focus on their material on how bad it is when you prescribe different versions of Anglicanism, and that no person should be forced to accept like conflicting like religious values here, because it is clearly within the interest of the global South Fellowship to push a conservative version of Anglicanism. But the second you left the Anglican community, you lost your seat at the table when it came to pushing your ideology. You allowed yourself to be viewed as weak and within the minority of this religion. You lost more people to the left. This was crippling for side affirmative. This is why you must vote side negative here. Several things in this speech. Firstly, a couple of critical points of setup. Secondly, why this was literally just sacrilege and just completely destroyed your like religious legitimacy. Thirdly, how we flipped the affirmative material, saying that once you leave, you would lose. This is where you lose adherence to your organization. And finally, what I talk about in my intro, which is that you lose this very crucial chance to weigh in on the debate and to actually pass your right-wing reforms within this broader religion. Firstly, on setup. First point, what does the Global South Fellowship actually look like? We think that it's important to consider how this occurs across most of global South, like Africa, the Global South, which is Africa, South Asia, like Latin America, which therefore means that these like churches are very decentralized, meaning that people the Brits like do not have like control over what like churches do in like rural Uganda, because these churches often exist in isolation. What do we think? Second point of setup. What do we think your interests are as the global like South Fellowship? Firstly, you do not want to commit sin. This will be very relevant in my next argument. Secondly, you want to just fundamentally survive and have followers to support your movement. We would like to note here that the Protestant movement is incredibly fragmented. You have your Baptists, you have your evangelicals, you have your charismatic churches, you have fundamentalists, you have so many groups, which is to say that all of these groups exist currently scattered across a very large ideological spectrum, which is that you are forced to compete for like Protestant like vote and Protestant like popularity. It was for this reason that you must actually stay relevant. You must actually stay within this spotlight. Secondly, your other incentive here is that you want to impose your ideology, because you believe that if people follow this wrong version of your religion, they are living out their life incorrectly. They will meet God's wrath, etc. This was important because you cared about like all souls equally. Your people were equal to like those souls in the West, like God created everyone equally, that kind of thing. But note here, you have more capacity to affect the souls of the West than the West did have like capacity to control like your souls, because since you existed in these churches within your country existed in like isolation, they were rural and decentralized churches. The West could not control you, whereas you had control of the West because the Anglican Church of England, because the Anglican Church of England was centralized. If they pushed through reforms on you, reforms on you, for example, to do with like they can't force you to accept same-sex marriage, but if you succeed in like stopping this, nobody in England can actually have same-sex marriage because it goes against the church. That was the fundamental reason why you were willing to take the gamble to stay in this fight and to try and impose your like reforms over more like a more centralized like version of Anglicanism. Note as well here, affirmative pushes that you can like leave and just like affiliate yourself with the North. We think you were already affiliated with like the Anglican Church of like North America. It's unclear as to why you need to leave the Anglican Communion to do this, but it was on our side where you had a better chance of pushing your ideology and having it viewed as the single and like most legitimate one. Onto my arguments. Firstly, why this was just sacrilegious and therefore destroyed your legitimacy within this religion, which is to say that the thing that makes Anglicanism different is that it believed in a single like central church. Like it was literally when it was founded by Henry VIII in response to Protestantism, as it was like too like divided. Therefore, like unity and having like a single body here was a fundamental crux of the religion, which meant importantly for our case, on a very principle level, to leave this and kind of cause that division was actual sin and going against the very core of your belief here. The impact is firstly, you feel as though you have committed sin, which went against, as a religious leader, your entire moral code, like what you had dedicated the majority of your life to. Secondly as well though, we thought that the Global Federation didn't have perfect control over churches because they were decentralized. So you ran the risk that, for example, like the Argentinian church disaffiliated from you and actually went back to rejoin exactly what you had just left. This will lead me on to my next argument, which is all about how you lose adherence, you lose your supporters and followers, which I note in my setup is so crucial to your survival because this was a uniquely competitive situation. So on to the second argument, why do you lose adherence? Firstly, as a corollary of argument 1, if you believe that you lose churches, you necessarily lose followers. But there are 2 further reasons here as to why you actually just fundamentally lost your competitive advantage in this situation. Firstly, you lost such a significant component of your legitimacy because when you were seen to have an external power backing you, you were immediately more attractive as a religion to conform to and to follow. When you leave the Anglican Communion, you were seen as immediately smaller. You lost your connection to the Church of England. Now a lot of people choose to go to another church over yours. Secondly, though, the Anglican Church of England was just extremely rich. There were 3 main reasons for this. Firstly, they were part of the state. Secondly, as a result of this, they benefited from immense government funding. Thirdly, had just benefited historically from colonialism. We would say that in the status quo, they wanted to help you to survive because you are part of them, and therefore they dedicate to you a significant amount of money and funding. Also because you conformed, especially because you conformed to a more conservative and kind of traditional version of this religion. The impact then was that you lost adherence to you because this detracted from your efforts to push your ideology in future. Note that these things are necessarily expensive. They require time, resources, manpower. These were things that funding and money had a significant influence over. Thirdly, though, we'd also just like to say that our side is the side that is much more likely to appeal to moderates. These are the people that you want to win over in kind of this religious battle. You had the potential to sway them over to a more conservative version of Anglicanism. But why did you actually have a really high chance of doing this if you remained within the Anglican Communion as opposed to severing yourself up? We thought that as a more conservative version of Anglicanism, on the right, you had the backing of this entire history of, oh, this is the traditional and very historically accurate version of Anglicanism. You were able to point to things in the Bible and exploit very traditional and conservative narratives that, same-sex marriage is bad and this is sin and you should not do this. You were able to exploit traditional views here and therefore win over moderates to your side. No, this was just impossible on side affirmative because you left and you immediately lost your connection to this very large group of people that helps your version of this religion survive. Finally, why do we think this just completely loses your chance to weigh in on the religious debate and pass your right-wing reforms, which is just very much in your interest? We thought in the status quo you were uniquely influential because you actually had this bargaining chip of threatening to leave. We think affirmative throws this away once and for all. This was never recoverable. Secondly, though, we thought that the global south was just really important. The west was going atheist, but Africa was growing in Christianity here. This was why it was really important that you retain kind of your competitive advantage here. But we also just thought that you leaving shifted the rest of the bloc left in response because you allowed yourself to be viewed as weak or the minority or your version of the religion was now brought as illegitimate. No, this had a matter of urgency as more and more people left to go to the left-wing side of religion. This was not something you could allow affirmative to do for a side negative. Woo.
Cool. I thank First Neg for that excellent speech and now invite Second Affirmative to continue the side proposition case. Hear, hear.
Cool. Alright, so as characterized by our first speaker, our overarching objective here is that we're looking to, first of all, protect the conservative ideology that, as the Global South Communion, we stand fervently by, and we're also looking to maintain and preserve the membership within this faction as well. So, for the most part, we believe that the best way to do this is actually to maintain a split from the Anglican Communion and joining our friends in the north, who share, of course, the same ideology as us. The negative team, has characterized this as kind of losing our seat at the table. I think in response to this, we actually have to look a bit deeper about what this seat at the table actually looks like if we choose to stay with the Anglican Communion. So, I think we can reasonably expect most conservatives who believe in the fundamentalist Anglican views, as we've already characterized, are pretty much incompatible with the kind of stuff the Anglican Communion is putting forth, things like same-sex marriage. There is no middle ground in that instance. If you are a fundamentalist conservative Anglican, you cannot recognize that same-sex marriage and things like female priests are acceptable in the church, because that is the overarching social worldview that you hold, and it at the same time is, again, fundamentalist and conservative. So we actually expect them to be like very incentivized to leave and to not support this kind of activity when they decide to go to church every Sunday. So that's why we expect them to leave, and for our like factional power brokering ability to be significantly reduced. So we have like, and I'll expand on this like kind of like factional power brokering a bit later, but we actually expect this seat at the table to be reduced in influence to the, like, even though we still have the ability to like propose reforms to like counteract the kind of like liberal ideology put forth by the Anglican Communion, we don't actually think that this is going to get anywhere. It's going to be effectively tokenistic, while we'd have a much better chance at passing reforms and actually like engaging and vocalizing our power base if we were to leave and join forces with the with our allies in the north. So I think that also just this like characterization that like we'd be effectively committing sin if we were leaving. I think that we can pretty easily like make an argument that when the Anglican Church, the Anglican Communion, decides to like embark on this like process of liberalisation, which for the most part is actually motivated not by like some incredible rereading of like traditional Anglican texts, but rather a motivation for them to be more like in tune with modern liberal society. We think that that's like, I think we can pretty easily like characterize that and frame it to our followers as like the greatest sin of all, as going against like traditional texts in the interests of appeasing to like Western liberal democracy and the values it promotes more. So I think that like that's also why we can reasonably expect our followers to remain with us, because again, like these kinds of reforms like aren't being sourced from any like radical rereading of texts, but rather outside influences on the church. Excellent. Also, just this final characterization that we like strongly disagree with on our side is that like we also don't believe that we actually have a chance at winning moderates, even if we remain in allegiance with the Anglican Communion. So again, the actual motivation of thinking behind these moderates and supporting these more liberal reforms isn't sourced from Anglicanism, it's sourced from outside pressures. So wanting to conform more with liberal thought and that sort of like more modern practices. So I think that that's why these reforms are first of all going to be very strong within the Anglican Communion, because they're focused on actually attracting people to join the religions and like preserving that moderate power base, while we're more focused on preserving our conservative power base. That's why we're better sourced over with the North. Right, moving on to substantive, I think that like probably one of the most important aspects of this debate to point out is that like the actual feasibility of this kind of union between us and the North, especially when you have this like other faction which has already been separated. I think that there's a number of problems that we can observe here. First one is this like competing ideas framework. As I've already pointed out, like things like same-sex marriage, that kind of debate, there is no real like middle ground to be made in the instance of like the church's position on that. And I think when we look down down the hierarchy to like individual priests teaching texts and stuff to people on a Sunday, it's very difficult for them to like form a middle ground, especially when we have this like huge ideological conflict within the church. It's very difficult for priests to fulfill their role of like teaching the religion and teaching this interpretation of the text when there is no clear position of the actual like Anglican Communion as a whole. Since we have these different ideological factions, we probably see different churches falling into different factions, and different priests are like siding with different factions within the church, which is likely just to antagonize people against the religion as a whole. And it's also just going to make it very difficult to communicate ideas and like fulfill our obligation as a church, which is of course communicating the will of God. And then just like expanding more onto this problem of factional power brokering. I don't think that it's going to work in the same sense as like a political party where you're going to get like better ideological outcomes or anything like that. I think that since we're looking at like ideologies which are fundamentally incompatible with one another, I think we're going to see like a lot of these reforms are going to be based on like how much power each individual faction has. I think we're going to be seeing people like priests and senior ministers within the church being appointed not on like merit or their like adherence to or knowledge on any particular text, but rather like appointed based on like individual factional power brokering. So we're going to see less talented and like knowledgeable and qualified people getting into positions of power and leadership within the church. Which I think actually, like even considering this as well, is really bad for us, because I think under like it's very difficult to prove otherwise that like conservatives are going to stay and support our faction in the Anglican Communion. I think that there's a very good chance that they're going to leave, to join the North, because again, they're going to be very disenfranchised with the kind of reforms which are getting passed through. They're going to have very little faith in our ability to counteract that. So therefore, there's a huge incentive on their end to just like stop putting up with the kind of like content that's being preached by their like during their sermons and Sunday services and stuff. They're likely going to leave and join a faction or a different like group entirely, where they actually have a chance of advancing the kind of reforms that they want. Yeah, and I just think like it all just comes down to how we expect conservatives to respond to this. I think that like as a result, we're going to lose this ideological battle, and our faction is effectively going to become tokenistic at best, and therefore, like that of course like moves on to my second main push, is just like this overarching benefit of ideological consolidation. Like if we were to leave and then take our power base with us and merge with the North, I think that like acknowledging the fact that the global South in particular has like a strong resurgence and power base of conservatives. When we combine that with the North, we can expect like a lot more ideological power being exercised by that particular faction. I don't think that this is like merely like splitting the like Anglicanism in half. I think this is like a new or renewed method of actually practicing Anglicanism. And I think that we've I think that this can actually we can expect this to compete with the likes of like other traditionalistic religions or conservative religions like Mormonism, for example, which by the way have gotten extremely rich off of maintaining their traditional power bases and like refusing to pass like ridiculous reforms. So I think that we can expect like our faction to actually survive if we do end up leaving. Thank you.
Yeah, feel free to. Cool. I think the second neg for that excellent speech. Finally invite third affirmative to conclude the slide proposition case. Here.
I think the problem so far is that we have to recognize that in the communions, the majority right now is much more predominantly liberal, especially now that the entire North faction has left the communion. We think that this means that the voice at the table within that communion is already particularly difficult for the people in the southern area. We think the problem with the negative team so far is that a lot of their material and benefits are contingent on actually being able to win that voice while they are at the table, which we think is very unlikely to actually happen. I'll note here firstly a little bit about legitimacy, and then I'll go into basically an issue about like the power of the southern the GSF, and then that will be split into firstly on like the membership aspect, and then secondly on like a messaging aspect. So firstly, just a little bit on legitimacy. So what we've heard from Neg is kind of about how, because like they leave the main communion, now they're a lot less legitimate, it's like less capacity to actually gain followers, etc. We think actually, they also like talked about how mainly the reason for that is because it's like sinful to leave like this whole line of like religion that has come back like way down in history. But we think in fact it's actually more sinful for these people who are very conservative, like these people have very strong beliefs. It's even more sinful for them to like stay in a communion where like their beliefs are like actually conflicting, and they're sitting there being like negligent and allowing atrocities, like things that actually go towards their core and like identity, to be like pushed onto like more people in the community, for them to like say that's okay, for them to then have to conform if they do lose that voice at the table. I think that's even more sinful. as opposed to like if they were to actually leave, we think then they gain even more recognition and legitimacy for the actual members of their like factions, and those are the people whose opinion they should care the most about, because they're their own members who they really want to like preserve, and these people are already in like kind of more of the minority group. We think that the most important people to be prioritizing. So in terms of like actual the power of this branch and like in terms of their memberships, we think what we've heard from AF is that okay, like because they've left, now you lose adherence because you're small, like A, smaller, and B, you're less connected to the COE, which is richer, and that is a big deal. So first on like about like them being smaller, I think like this isn't true, because in fact you do gain all of the conservatives in the South already. Maybe that is somewhat smaller to the people in the COE, but note that now you have like really devout people who are actually aligned with the interests of your faction. Though that's a lot of people in the entire like southern region of America, and we already know that they will get like backing from the North. So it like asserts that, oh, like they're already aligned with the North, like oh, they can already get financial backing. No, they can't if they're aligned with the COE, because you have to actually turn their back. Like the North literally turned their back and made that big leap to step out of the COE. Why are they going to be like supporting and like especially financially towards like the southern region if they are still aligned with the COE, especially if it sounds like the COE, if as they say and have characterized as like really rich and actually giving money to the conservative faction, then we wouldn't have like actual backing from the North. Instead, we think on the comparative, you get actual legitimate tangible backing from the North if you do like separate from the COE, and then because the North has already done this process and left, then it's less risky for the southern faction to like leave and then do it in a way that they already have like someone who's done it before. We think it's stronger and there's like incentives from both like the North and the South to work together and be stronger, and like so it's not so it's actually like quite a lot of people together, and they would be quite strong. In terms of like really financial aspects, why like just because the COE is rich, why does that not translate to actually helping the southern faction? So we think it's unlikely. So A, it's unlikely for that money from the COE to actually go towards any causes that the really conservative branch actually agree with, and we think that it's much more likely to go to liberal projects or like to go to campaigning of like messages that are actually much more liberal, like promoting same-sex marriage and things about how like everyone's sort of God's children, for example, whereas like the conservative branch, like that's like what they care about. It's like, no, you can't have same-sex marriage. We think like there are certain instances where you have very conflicting and incompatible beliefs, so then it's unlikely for that money to actually go help them. But we think even like even on a principle level, like we don't think they want to be supporting that money going to like any of those causes. Like they it'd be better, like even if they had less money, it's better for them to still be true to like the actual causes of their own faction. But also in terms of like this financial stuff, like Jack has also talked to you a lot about how like it's really just impractical to really function as a church when you have such like conflicting beliefs, like, and you have a lot of infighting, and we think that means even more that the money isn't actually going to be translated towards causes of the southern faction. For example, like you get there's a lot of scripture and like things that are very difficult to translate, a lot of things that like that priest that has been selected won't necessarily like push messages that aligns with our southern faction. But then we hear like a bit of content about like whether or not you sway moderates, and we think like, okay, well, some moderates will still like be likely to still join if they're like new members who have thought, okay, they do kind of align with this messaging. But why we think it's unlikely for them to, while being in the communion, to actually sway moderates. A, we think because the liberal voice, as we've stated, is a lot bigger, it's harder for them to actually get that voice and to actually sway other people. B, we think it's very convoluted when you have a lot of different different messages within that like one communion. Then, and also C, we have like everything in Roger's first speech about how you get more streamlined messaging when you are by yourself as opposed to when you are in there, which is why like you're unlike to actually sway the moderates who all they hear about is like the regular liberal messaging. Even if we could sway them while in the communion, we think it's more important to actually be keeping the strong ideology for our own members. We don't think they've proven why like the moderates were the most important people in this debate. Even if they could sway a bit more, we think it's more important for the majority of the actual people within this church to actually feel like they can practice properly. Okay, and then but they do really push so much about how, like, oh, we really want to see it at the table, but we want to note that, like, if you lose while you're at that seat at the table, just how big of a risk it is. We don't think, like, Neg really acknowledges this, because it's like such, like, it's so harmful to those people within the communion if they now have to be subject to, like, ideologies about same-sex marriage. Now they have to listen to a female priest when to their core they believe that that female priest isn't going to be able to respect or, like, voice, like, their own concerns. We think those are really, really big harms, and it's much more important than things like whether you can sway a moderate or whether you have, like, illegitimacy on, like, a world level. I think these are the things that are most important. But based on also our message, all of the material about, like, how you get better streamlined messaging, we think that means you have more of a voice outside of the communion as opposed to that you have a tiny voice at the seat of the table. What did we tell you? We said, like, you have more streamlined messaging because it's easier to mobilize and galvanize people with one particular message. We think so. Neg has we do acknowledge that yes, different discussions are great, but then that's only to the extent that you still somewhat align with the other people, not when you literally have conflicting ideas about, like, yes, you can have same-sex marriage or no. I think it's easier to have a code of conduct as well about how you actually live your life when it's based on one particular method, which then means that it's easier for you to get people to join you or to maintain the people in your society, and that is why we're so proud to propose.
Cool. I thank third affirmative for that excellent speech, and finally invite third neg to conclude their case and the debate. Here. You're going to be definitely out of frame, just saying.
Oh yeah, no, it's a pretty common thing. All my good speeches are like that, and then all my bad speeches, like, you can see because from a different angle. So let's hope that's a good sign. I wonder where my other argument go. Oh, that's here. The most devastating claim we make in Josie's speech is one of geography. That is the pretty simple observation that where Britain is a very small and centralised church, the global south is incredibly diverse, and the vast majority of churches there are affiliated many steps down the chain from the Church of England. They are the Global South Fellowship, then your local fellowship, then your state fellowship, then your individual church. And B, they're very isolated. Many of them are in very rural communities, particularly because those are the ones that tend to be religious. Many of them, even if they're not in rural communities, are in states that are quite far away from Britain, states that are very religious, for example, Uganda. That had two incredibly important parts to this debate. First thing it shows is that a lot of the characterization you get in that third affirmative speech doesn't work. Because, as we explained at first to no response, they were never going to impose upon you to do same-sex marriage. They were never going to make you select female priests. Because the capacity of the Church of England, even if it was formal doctrine, even if you lost the debate, to actually impose that upon you was incredibly low. And the second problem is that it means that diversity within your message is fine, because it's totally unclear why, if I am a person attending a very conservative church in Uganda, and I hear that in Argentina they are preaching a much more liberal form of my religion, I actually would A, know about that, or B, particularly care why that kind of divergence in message would actually be very important to people. The way people engage with churches is local. If your local church is conservative, they can just preach the conservative version of the faith. I'm going to start with sin, then talk about the international context, then talk about local influence. Let's start with sin, because it is the easiest path for us to win the debate. Because this debate is from the perspective of religious leaders. They inherently, and with a strong revealed preference, do not want to sin against a religion. They have grown up their entire lives indoctrinated into an ideology. Sin against that ideology is devastating. We make a very important claim that gets no contestation. That is, the premise of Anglicanism, the thing that makes it different from every other form of Protestantism, makes it different from evangelicism, different from baptism, different from the Quakers, is that it is centralized, is that it was part of the church hierarchy of the British state when it was created. And so, the greatest sin against Anglicanism is to split from that church hierarchy, is to disaffiliate yourself. And that's incredibly important, because what it means is, firstly, your local churches that also believe in this just disaffiliate from you at the point where you do that. And I think that's really devastating for all of the reasons that they identify that you care about those local churches. But B, and even more importantly, as a religious leader, you feel like you have gone against the fundamental tenet of your faith. Your faith is one of a central hierarchy that trickles down, and you have broken away from that hierarchy. You are taught that there are superiors above you, and you have disobeyed them. That is incredibly bad. Their claim here in response is pretty weak. They say, well, actually, reinterpreting the Bible is sin, so really the Anglican Church in England is doing the sin, and you can spin it that way. The problem with this is it actually misunderstands how Anglicanism works. Firstly, I guess maybe this isn't OIB, but the Anglicanism follows a historical critical opinion, so it literally interprets the text based on context. They've reinterpreted the text many times. Perhaps the OIB doesn't know that, in which case the thing they definitely do know is that the Anglican Church literally reinterpreted the Bible, right? That is what they did when they split it from Catholicism, is they're like, man, you guys are interpreting the Bible wrong. We reinterpret it. And they've continued to do that. For example, they used to support monarchy. The OIB definitely knows that Britain is no longer a full monarchy. Those kinds of changes have been fine. It's totally unproven by this team that reinterpretation is actually a sin. I think it's something Anglicanism is totally fine with, and I think Anglicanism is fine to have that kind of reinterpretation. They do not prove why that is a sin. So I think clearly on the issue of sacrilege, we are up in this debate. Let's then marginally extend and talk about international influence, which I think is perhaps the most important issue in the debate for the reason that all souls are equal under God. All men were created equal under God. But there are many more people who are Anglican in the UK than there are in most of the Global South, for the simple reason that the Global South is, as we characterized it first, split between a vast number of different Protestant denominations, whereas the Church of England is basically the only Protestant denomination in England. So almost everyone in England follows this church, whereas it's very diverse in other areas. Their claim on international influence is, well, we can go work with the Americans. The responses. First, as we pointed out at the first negative, literally the start of the speech, to no response. You can just do this in the status quo. We can do this too. Look at the info slide of this today. It says, we recognize that American split off church. I do not understand why we cannot work with that church anyway. But secondly, I would actually flip this for the reason that I reckon the reason the American church cares about you is they want to get recognized by the Anglican Communion, right? Because that's what gives them legitimacy. So they're working with you to the extent that you are a pathway for them to get into Anglican Communion. When you leave the Anglican Communion too, you become useless to them. There's no reason why they would work with you. And finally, I would just say the utility of these guys is really unclear. Maybe these are generalizations. I would say firstly, these guys are from the they're white people in the American South. They're probably just really racist, right? You're a church of African churches, and this is asking American white fundamentalists to fund you. Seems a bit sus. Secondly, there are just a lot of very poor areas inside the US that they would already be directing their funding to. So it's unclear that they're directing their funding to you, unlike the Church of England, which we've explained is very rich. But we also win the deadlock breaker in international influence, which is the incredibly debate-winning argument, which is just we are the team that is able to win the debate within the broader Anglican movement and thus impose our ideology on every single Anglican person in Britain. Why are we able to do that? Firstly, we've explained Africa is incredibly important to the church because the West is going atheist, no response. Second, we've explained this is an incredibly important bargaining tool because you can threaten to leave, they throw it away, no response. Third, we've explained that you would piss off everyone to the point where you leave, which is why they would react against you by becoming far more progressive. Their only response is, well, the US has already left the group, so the conservative faction has gotten weaker. Firstly, no tipping point analysis of why this makes this conservative faction totally weaker. But secondly, that just clearly means we should stay, right? We shouldn't give up the fight because the US has. We're the last bastion of conservatism. We should just fight all the harder. Obviously, this argument is uncertain, but the gamble is risk-free for the reason we explained it first. That is, if you lose, the British church cannot impose same-sex marriage onto you. But if you win, because the British church is very centralized, they can impose not doing same-sex marriage on themselves. So we are the side which has a risk-free gamble that is able to get you a huge amount of win. Finally, let's talk about local influence. And the premise of this argument is very clear, because both sides agree it, which is, in the Global South, the Protestant movement is incredibly cutthroat, because there are so many different denominations, all competing for adherence. So I guess to margin extent, let's explain why you win over those adherents. Firstly, where are you more legitimate? Their claim is you're more legitimate under our side because we can preach one unified message. Two problems with this. Firstly, as we've explained to no response, you can just preach your conservative message. There's no reason that you have to actually go acknowledge all the same-sex marriage, right? What it means to be in communion with them is that if hypothetically some white Westerner who had had their same-sex marriage officiated in England rocked up at your church, you'd have to treat them as legitimate. But the chance of that happening is so inscrutably low that I don't think that actually matters. It would never affect how you preach. And secondly, just don't preach about same-sex marriage. Just talk about literally any other thing, right? You don't have to talk about this at church. Then they say, well, there's factional problems. Firstly, this is untrue because most nations tend to be religiously very similar, so it's unlikely that there are that many different denominations. Like there's a huge progressive wing in Uganda and a huge conservative wing in Uganda. Probably Uganda is as a whole conservative, and for example, Britain is as a whole more progressive. So it's a national factionalism, not the local factionalism they explain. But secondly, this misunderstands churches. Like you can just have the more factional, like one church will be more radical, one church is more conservative. It doesn't really matter, right? Because like they just don't cooperate with each other. You engage primarily with your local church. Finally, how do we win local influence? In two very important ways. First, we explain that in the incredibly competitive market of Protestant denominations, the unique thing about you is that you're associated with a different external power that gives you legitimacy. That's incredibly important. It helps you stand out. And secondly, we explain the deadlock breaker of funding, because they say, well, funding's going to go to liberal projects like same-sex marriage. Guys, be real. Like the Church of England is not funding same-sex marriage campaigns in Uganda. It is funding things they mutually agree on. Like, for example, service provision for people. That kind of service provision is something people support. It is something that allows you autonomy. Clearly, we win this way.
Cool. I think third neg, feel free to cross the floor and shake hands. We're going to delib and give an OA afterwards.
They've already left.
They haven't formally split, but they've declared that they're no longer recognised as a community, which is basically
Before the debate has already been adjudicated.
Going to give the result, and then 2 to 3 pieces of general feedback, and then I'm going to explain the decision. So I thought this was a good to high quality round. I gave this in a very close call to side negative, noting that the chair was in the majority of a split vote, so my trainee split for me. That'd be reflected both in the OA and the ballot. The 2 to 3 pieces of general feedback starts firstly. I think there should be much more of a distinction between the governing body, the church, in both areas, i.e. the South, the North, and in England, as well as the strict disciplinary implications that has on the people on the ground. Because I think that distinction is insufficiently clear in most speeches and is often homogenized to the detriment of both teams' arguments and their strategy in the vast majority of instances. So that's the first thing. The second piece of general feedback is I think there should be more mechanistic scrutiny on the reasons itself of, for example, why splintering might be good or bad, or why homogeneity on side negative might be good or bad. For the simple reason that this is a very chestnutty case that can be run for most religious debates. It's just like, should X actor split from doctrine or stay with doctrine? And what are the implications on, religion or whatever context that it's specifically set in? So I think noticing that and incorporating that into the strategy would be particularly useful. And the final thing is, I don't know very much about this context, but I think it would be more useful if there was more framing and characterization at the beginning of cases of just what is going on. Because I think some of the names that are used in the info slide don't actually lend themselves to telling me about the characteristics or the context of these churches and how they actually function. And while this does definitely come out in certain aspects of second and third and latter speeches, I think it'd be much more useful and much clearer if it come out at the beginning. So I'm going to firstly outline the incentives and the characterization of these churches and then move on to the AF and the neg arguments for why they align and disalign. Characterization is twofold, predominantly pushed by this negative team. They explain firstly that the vast majority of churches in this global south or in the umbrella of this association are largely rural and isolated, and at the very least, many steps removed from the main Anglican body and church that exists in Britain. And this isn't very much contested, so I just buy this characterization. I think it is relatively charitable to accept this, and this seems structurally true for the reasons that they give regarding geography. The second and less, credible piece of characterization I'm willing to buy is this stuff about the Central Church and King Henry. I think historically this is true, but it's unclear to me the extent to which this is particularly important in the doctrinal truths of these religions and the way that they operate. Like, does the Anglican Church in England consult what Henry would have done, and is that how they operate, or is that different? So the extent to which this is influential is unclear, and as such, relatively underweighed. Cool. The final piece of context that is provided here, there's 3, is that this movement and this kind of decision and this crossroad is as a byproduct of a generally liberal shift by Anglican bodies and religious bodies and Christian bodies as a whole in the status quo, which I think is relatively fair to buy given that is what is empirically true. I think there's two broad incentives that both teams kind of agree on, but to different extents. So negative team more highly prioritizes upholding doctrine and interpretation and uses this as a win path, whereas affirmative rely on, and not necessarily to their detriment, on the single mechanism and the single metric of preserving the institutional adherence and the flock and their ability to, I guess, go to church and be happy and things like that. So the first thing I'm going to talk about in terms of argumentation is what AF is able to offer, and then the responses negative team have regarding AF's main pushes. I think affirmative team has two broad pushes. The first one is on streamlined ideology, noting that in the status quo, they explain to me that there is a massively contradictory set of messages that is likely to be coming out and hurting the people on the ground. They explain this as alienating for the most important members, that is the base, the most conservative members who do things like preach, do things like campaign, are the most dogmatic and most devout. And it leads to things like confusion and questions of faith from these groups of people. The second harm related to ideology is an explanation of internal splintering and the existence of factions and antagonization with these factions, communication breakdowns within these factions. Maybe some factions want to do this thing, some factions want to do this other thing, and that leads to a bunch of harms. Third and final thing they explained to me is that this ideology acts as a barrier for more conversion and more attraction because you're worrying about all of this crap instead of worrying about having a homogenized message to kind of congregate your people. So the second thing they offer in terms of argumentation is a counterfactual, which is that if they left, they would probably, move towards an allegiance with the North or the Anglican body in the North of the States. I think there's a few responses I like to flag specifically here. Negative team tells me two things. Firstly, it's asserted to me, and it's not clear to me the extent of why this might be true, but apparently the North would use them as a tool. Maybe I buy this. I think this is unlikely and is entirely underexplained, so I credit this far less. But I think the more persuasive response here is that it is unlikely for them to be actually aligned in their ideologies and in their processes. They might be aligned insofar as they dislike the central church in Britain, but it's unclear to me that they will, as a result of that, move together in similar avenues in their opposition to that church, given the framing, for example, that these people might be particularly racist, might have different interpretations of Anglicanism, which would not be compatible with the Southern Church. I think that this counterfactual is possible, but is largely unfruitful, I think, for this Southern Church. I think the impact is quite obvious. Like, if you leave, your conservative base stays, you're able to consolidate these resources and these messages, and that's a particularly good thing. There's a direct strategic response from this negative team, which is to weaponize this characterization of localization and isolation, and to explain that this allows the Southern Church first to pick and choose which narratives they want to allow and which narratives they want to propagate, and secondly, it gives them the capacity to take the best of both worlds. It allows them to worry and align themselves with the Anglican Church in England when it benefits them, and to prioritize contradictory messages insofar as they don't want to follow this thing, don't want to follow having female priests, for example. They don't have to. And I think it's relatively clearly explained from first negative and down the bench to some extent that there's probably no impetus for the centralized church to push the churches in Uganda, for example, to actually make them have female priests, for example, and things like that. So I believe that there are a set of harms that accrue on side affirmative, but I think this is heavily mitigated by this negative team. Negative team, and this is the second part of this, explanation, has a few pushes. They firstly explain to me this group of moderates that are much more likely to be, co-opted by them insofar as they stay. They weigh this with some numerical analysis telling me that there are more moderates than conservatives, therefore they're the more important party. I think this is maybe true, but the response from affirmative is just like, you're also competing at a much larger pie because all of these moderates are also, competed for by other churches and other religions. So maybe it's true that you get moderates and they are definitely a bigger body. It's very mechanistically unclear from this negative team the extent to which exclusively staying allows you to co-opt the moderate base. Secondly, and much more substantially from this negative team, is an explanation of church funding, which is like the British church in the Anglican network, gives you some amount of funding, which would be exclusive to them and not accessible by this affirmative team. And I note that there is some split on the panel here on the importance and the weighing of this funding and the implication of this funding. I brought this to be facilitative insofar as it allows these churches to do some of the things that they need to do, whereas my panelist and my trainee thought that it was less useful. So I guess in terms of feedback to the negative team and to the affirmative team, more attack can be made there and much more substantiation can be made by this negative team. Anyways, regardless of that, I think the amount of funding that affirmative is able to claim from alternative sources, i.e. the Northern Church in this alliance after you move, funding you, is mitigated insofar as the same response here is just like, it's probably a secondary prioritization. Both the British and the Northern American churches, or whatever the heck they're called, probably prioritize their own flock first, and then secondarily give this money to the Southern churches. Noting that this is an implicit tension that is in the negative case as well. This isn't pointed out, but I guess I just flagged that in the OA. So the other slew of kind of harms that are largely unresponded to are things like the power vacuum, things like using the structural organization as a bargaining tool to, elicit concessions and things like that, with the impact of just being more centralized, having more access to resources and things like that. It's unclear to me that this is really, really important, given that this is somewhat mitigated by some of the tensions in your case, because you guys go like, well, we pick some of the good things, but by picking and choosing, you will also isolate yourself from the main church and the willingness of the main church to help you out. But given that this isn't picked up explicitly by this affirmative team, and given they don't rebut the majority of the, benefits/harms that this negative team case has in terms of positive material, I buy them to a greater extent, given that the affirmative benefits are explicitly rebutted. So for that reason, I gave this debate in a close margin, very close margin to side negative.